community outreach and engagement at Education Voters of Pennsylvania. I will be the moderator for today's panel. That'll focus on Pennsylvania's school funding lawsuit and what it means for our schools and our students. I'm happy to introduce our two panelists for today. We have Susan Spicka, who is the Executive Director of Education Voters of Pennsylvania. And we have Claudia Palma, who is a staff attorney at the Public Interest Law Center, who works closely on Pennsylvania's school funding lawsuit. I'm going to let them take it away and present on the lawsuit and what it means for our students.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. So I'm Claudia Palma. I was one of the attorneys in the trial team of the school funding lawsuit. And so I'm here with a PowerPoint that I promise I will try not to make boring. Just to kind of break down what we've been doing the last many years, but especially the last two, to try to advance this case forward and how it's turning out. So feel free to interrupt with questions as I go. But for those who are less familiar with how we got where we are now, which is having had a whole trial about the school funding system in Pennsylvania. For a very long time, there were many longstanding problems, and there were problems that advocates talked about, worked on, rallied about, litigated about. In Pennsylvania, there's no goal of fully funding school. There's no, for a very long time, there hasn't been an assessment of what is actually needed to fund the system and then to put that funding into place. We also, in Pennsylvania, have one of the lowest relative state contributions in the whole country, meaning that the state puts in far less in Pennsylvania than they do in other states. The funding that the state does provide, a lot of it doesn't go through what's called the fair funding formula. So over 10 years ago, a formula was put into place to try to distribute state dollars to schools based on need. The majority of the money that the state allocates for education funding every year, though, doesn't go through that formula. And so it's sort of entrenched in old data and old information about what schools need, how many students are in a district, et cetera. This inadequate state funding has, as you can imagine, led to enormous gaps in funding between the highest and the lowest wealth school districts, because what the state's not putting in comes through local taxes. And so depending on what kind of district you live in, what kind of tax base you have, what kind of local wealth you have, you're going to have a very different district. And in that way, what you've ended up with is these low wealth communities which need the most, try the hardest, have the least. And this is just one of the many data points that we talked about at trial, but it is the sort of sum total of when you assess what schools actually need based on the formula, based on the data that the state provides. Our expert at trial established that at least as of 2021, we are $4.6 billion under, meaning that is a gap. That is what is lacking in the system to bring it up to adequacy, what the schools actually need to provide education to their students. The lawsuit was filed in 2014. And it wasn't the first time that people went to court to try to challenge the system and to try and make it more adequate and more equitable. But this is the lawsuit that we are currently still in. So yes, I did say 2014. It was brought on behalf of 6 school districts, which are listed there, families, and 2 statewide organizations, the NAACP Pennsylvania State Chapter and PARS, which is the Pennsylvania Association of Rural and Small Schools. And it was brought against basically the government. The governor, the Pennsylvania Department of Education, and the leaders of our General Assembly, the Speaker of the House and the President Pro Tem of the Senate. So in 2014, we filed it. These are our petitioners again. 6 of the 500 or 499, depending on how you count, school districts in Pennsylvania that we believe really illustrate a lot of the problems that the districts across the state do see. And then parents in some of those districts, and a parent in Philadelphia. Philadelphia wasn't a district petitioner in the school, but in the funding case, but we presented a lot of evidence about Philadelphia's school district needs and the struggles that they have is one of the biggest. So 2014 is when we filed it, but 2017 is when we finally finished arguing about the right for the case to be heard at all. So for the first 3 years of the case, the leaders of the General Assembly fought, and the governor to some degree fought against the idea that a court could evaluate whether the school funding system was adequate in the first place. There's something called a political question doctrine. There's this idea that there are some things that are really just policy questions, they're really just political issues, political decisions that are left to our political branches, and the court isn't empowered and isn't capable really of making a decision about them. And so that was the first sort of leg of the fight. And we went to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, and they agreed with us that no, this is a case that can be heard in court. This is what courts do all the time. There's a constitutional provision, which I'll get to in a minute, that petitioners say have been violated by the way the system is funded. And that's exactly what courts do. They look at the Constitution, they interpret what it means, and then they assess whether it's been violated. So from 2017 until now, we've been working on this case, and that has involved experts, that has involved lots of depositions back and forth, lots and lots of documents, lots and lots of preparation to start a trial that then lasted 4 months, from about November 2021 to March 2022. And time has been blurry for everyone because of the pandemic, but it's been especially blurry for me because it has been a long time and it's been a long haul. So the trial itself was 49 days, dozens of witnesses. We introduced across all the parties 1,700 exhibits. This was data, this was a course guide, this was photos of school conditions, and we created about 15,000 pages of trial testimony. Just, the court judge, President Judge Renee Cohn-Jubilee are sitting patiently through 4 months of presentation of evidence. And then after that happened, there were briefs, there was argument before the court about all the different issues that the court was going to have to decide. And that ended in July, and between July and this past February, we waited and the court worked. The court worked to look through the entire transcript, to consider everything that she had heard, to think about all the legal decisions that she had to make in order to understand the evidence. And in February, she issued an opinion. And many of you hopefully have heard about this decision, but it came out in February, and it was the court's ruling that we had established our case, that we had proven our claims, which were basically under the education laws of Pennsylvania, that the school funding system is both inadequate, not enough money in it, and inequitable. That money isn't going to the students according to their needs. So she, the opinion she issued was little shy of 800 pages. And so as hard as it may be to sit through this PowerPoint, I promise it is easier than sitting down and reading the whole 800-page opinion. Not that it wasn't excellent. But what I'll try to do here is just try to explain what she found, the implication of it, and what comes next. And then Susan's going to bring in sort of what we can all do now that this lawsuit is coming to an end. So the basic question was, does the system of public education comply with the Pennsylvania Constitution? Our federal constitution, the US Constitution, doesn't have a right to education. But we argued the Pennsylvania Constitution does. This is the piece of the Constitution in Pennsylvania that we relied on for our case. So it says the General Assembly shall provide for the maintenance and support of a thorough and efficient system of public education to serve the needs of the Commonwealth. And so our case basically had two claims. One was that the state is in violation of this because the system is underfunded. And the second was that because of the way the system is underfunded, the equal protection rights of students in low wealth school districts are being violated. And so because this isn't being fulfilled for all students, those students who live in low wealth communities are the ones bearing the burden of the violation. So they are being treated differently under the law than students in high wealth districts, simply because of where they live. And so those are the two claims. And as you can imagine, the very first thing that the court had to figure out was, what does that mean? What does that clause of the Constitution mean? We had experts come in, we had a constitutional law expert come in and look at the debates of the Constitution when this clause was first put into place. There was a lot of arguing back and forth in briefs and an argument about what the meaning of, for example, the term thorough and efficient is. That was put into place in 1874. It's been a long time, usage of the words changes, and a court had never really squarely looked at that and decided what it meant. And so the very first thing that the court did was decide what it meant. And so this is what the court believes the Education Clause requires, that every student be provided with a meaningful opportunity to succeed academically, socially, and civically, which requires that all students have access to a comprehensive, effective, and contemporary system of public education. And she found this based on what the words mean, what the words meant when they were put in the Constitution in 1874, and how other states who have education clauses like this have interpreted those words. The court also had to decide whether that language that you saw in the Pennsylvania Constitution provides a right to education. So it isn't written as like everyone has a right to education, right? It says the General Assembly shall provide a thorough and efficient system of education. So the court had to decide whether that conferred a right and what kind of right that conferred. So there are different levels of right. There are some that the courts and our society hold in the most high regard. They're called fundamental rights. Then there are other rights that are perhaps something you can interpret from how the society has developed and grown, but they're not obviously squarely in the Constitution. And the court, we argued that the Education Clause conferred a fundamental right, the most important, most protected kind of right, and the court agreed. So this was another finding, another outcome of the trial. We also had to prove that the current system, so we won on those points. We won on what does the Education Clause require. The state on the other side, the leaders of the General Assembly argued what it required was a standard basic minimum education. So they argued that the level of quality of the education that had to be provided was lower than what we advocated for as something that was comprehensive, something that was contemporary, that like evolved with the times, something that was effective, meaning it actually produced good results for students. Whereas the General Assembly argued that really all it required was opportunity, meaning you open the doors, you put the books on the table, and students do with that with them. And that's the basic standard that they offer. Teachers at the front of the classroom, and you can't really look at the outcomes that that produces. That's not part of what they believe the education system should have. So once the court decided, no, actually, I do believe that the Education Clause requires much more, she then had to evaluate whether the current system actually meets that standard. So we had to, that's where all the 4 months of testimony came in. We had to prove everything that you could imagine, including things that you might not think had to be proved. And one of the very basic premises that we fought over was, what does it mean for a child to learn? What does it mean for a child to be given a meaningful opportunity to learn? And there were some arguments from the other side about, children come into school with all sorts of barriers, challenges, out of school factors, poverty, language barriers, a lack of interest in education, and you can't blame us for how those kids do this. And we had experts come in and show, no, actually, with the right resources, there are interventions, there are supports that can address a whole range of student needs, that poverty is not destiny, and that with the right resources, every child can, and the court agreed with that, just the fundamental basic premise. And by the way, all these words are from her opinion, just so you know, not mine. We had an expert that tried to explain another basic premise, which is that when you're funding a system, it has to be related to the need. And so when you're evaluating that system, it has to be based on, okay, well, are they getting what they need? Not are they getting X amount or Y amount, or does it sound like a big number, but is it tied to what the needs of the district actually are? And so Dr. Kelly was one of our prime experts, and you'll see the same throughout this presentation. He's a professor out of Penn State that does like economics of education. He looked at the state data, he looked at the way our funding formula is supposed to work, and he showed the court that when you're looking at how many students are in a district, what those students need, you really have to look at their actual adjusted need, right? And what the district actually needs, like how many kids are living in poverty in that district, how many students are English language learners, how many students are special ed kids, and that when you're comparing funding figures, you have to think about it that way. So that was another sort of baseline principle that we had to prove and that the court agreed with us on. And so then, once all of that groundwork was laid out, it was up to us to prove that there just isn't enough funding. And the court looked at a lot of different data points for this. I told you we had our 6 districts present to give sort of an illustrative picture, but we weren't saying that these are the only 6 districts that are underfunded. We were explaining the ways in which their experience and their story, the story of the teachers, the story of the superintendents, and the stories of the families that went to these districts, how their experiences were really characteristic. And so the court looked at all that, which I'll get to in a minute, but the court also looked at some statewide realities. It looked at the fact that long time ago, the state actually did what's called a costing out study and figured out how much it would cost to provide education to the students of Pennsylvania. And they also used to calculate what was called adequacy targets and adequacy shortfalls. So how much did a district need? How much was it short of that based on what it could raise in its own capacity? And there have been other developments since, like the fair funding formula, that recognized that need needed to be a bigger part of how money was distributed. And most recently Level Up, which was an effort to provide additional funding to the lowest funded districts with the highest needs. So all of these things recognize that not only do we, the petitioners, know that this district is, that this system is underfunded, but that the legislators, the legislation that they have done for this makes it clear, like they also know that more is needed. And so a lot of the evidence we put forward, as I explained, were about how low wealth districts are disproportionately affected by the way the school funding system is funded. I said earlier that there were huge gaps between the lowest and the highest wealth districts. Basically, when you adjust for need, meaning you think about what the students need, whether they're living in poverty, whether they're English language learners, whether they have other issues that require them to have a higher level of intervention, that when you adjust for need, the poorest school districts have almost $8,000 less to spend per student than the highest wealth school districts. So that's a per student number. If you think about every child sitting in a classroom, each of those children would get $8,000 more for their education if they lived sometimes right across the county lines. And I mentioned before that often these low wealth school districts are educating a higher number of students who are refugees, students who are living in poverty. There's huge racial divisions in the state, and where the students who are Black and brown are concentrated, it's really starkly in the local school districts. And the other feature that we established for the court was that these low wealth school districts can't tap their way out of this problem. So that $8,000 that they're missing per kid, there's no way to raise taxes high enough to make that money up in local wealth. Either they don't have the capacity, or they don't have the property, or they don't, they just cannot. There were some stories of school districts who actually raised taxes and ended up yielding less money. People just could not afford taxes, and they do tax themselves. We also established way over what some high wealth districts tax, just to try to make that gap a little smaller. And the court credited all that, and also credited the fact that low wealth school districts, like our petitioner districts, just don't have what they need. And what do they need? The court also made some findings about that. What is essential to a thorough and efficient education? And so she listed the essential elements, which are adequate funding, of course, which we've talked about, and then the things that the funding buys, right? So courses, curricula, programs that prepare students to go to college and get careers, teachers, staff, specialists, counselors, facilities, just the buildings you're in and how they work, whether you have technology that connect to Wi-Fi and actually use your computer, whether you have a computer at all. And quality instrumentalities of learning, which are books and paper and all that, but also science labs, things that students need right now to be competitive in their life after school. So I'm just gonna spin through some of these. Court found, and believe it or not, all of these were contested, right? They were either contested by respondents by saying, no, they have enough teachers, it's fine. Or you don't really need this many reading specialists. We don't really know if counselors make a difference. We don't really know if psychologists are really an integral part of what a school should be doing. That's sort of something that community behavioral health should be doing at school. But so there were fights along all these lines about, what does it mean to have sufficient well-trained adults in school? Who are those adults? How many do you need? How do you figure out how many you need? What happens when you don't need them or when you don't have them? And so, for example, we had some pretty stark examples of the court found in many of the districts, teachers have to teach multiple classes of different subjects simultaneously. So, for example, in Shenandoah, there are more than 10 teachers conducting multiple classes of different subjects to different students at the same time. So that would be like algebra and geometry, same classroom, 2 sets of kids, same time. I think there was an example of like an AP music, but also like a 7th grade music class going on at the same time with one teacher. And the court agreed that it's beyond cavil to say this is not effective learning. It's not giving students the kind of education that's actually going to produce good outcomes. She also took a really big look at facilities. I know that where I'm living and when my kids go to school in Philadelphia, facilities are a massive problem. They're old, they need a lot of work, and that work hasn't been able to be done in a very long time. And we showed a lot of pictures. This is where, don't worry, you're gonna get some pictures in this presentation, I promise. We showed the court a lot of pictures about the conditions that the students are going to school in and how those impact learning and how much those conditions would cost to actually fix. So there were, pictures of cracks in foundations. These are, long known problems that school districts were, they testified about how they were constantly problem shooting, like, okay, what am I going to fix? What am I going to leave broken for another year? How are we going to afford this? Who are we going to have to furlough? Who are we going to have to do without? Remember I said, we need a lot of teachers to help students. Well, maybe we have to go without these teachers to fix the crack in the foundation. And the districts were able to really lay out the ways in which these sort of impossible decisions were always kind of on the menu, which the court acknowledged was what she called a Hobson's choice, just not a false choice, not actually the kind of decision that you make if you're able to, if what you're trying to do is run a school district in the right way. Here are some other photos we showed. I think there were like 100 of them. Most of our districts, the superintendent walked the court through, like, this is, this classroom, this is what happened to ceiling tiles. We've had this trash can there for, a very long time. And so the court was able to really see what the districts were working with. This is a breakout, like a pull-out class that's meeting in the hallway. Oops, sorry. Another sort of foundation/water problem. And so we were able to incorporate a lot of these pictures into our presentation of the evidence as well. The court also looked at what does it mean to have instrumentalities of learning. And respondents said, look, books, pencils, paper, everybody has a Chromebook now because of COVID. They're okay, they're fine. It's not one of the legislative leaders in their opening statement said, it's not the Taj Mahal, but it's fine. And the court also really pushed back on that and said, yeah, they're not as rudimentary as legislative respondents suggest. So in the 21st century, students need more than a desk, chair, pen, paper, and textbooks. And she said, and by the way, those aren't looking so great in districts either. But they do not constitute a thorough and efficient system of education. They don't provide what the Constitution requires. They have to be provided a meaningful opportunity to succeed academically, socially, and civically. So what does that mean in the 21st century? And she talked about the fact that meant technology, and that meant STEM labs, and that meant a number of other things that students need Wi-Fi, to access the modern world and the world they're going to be living in when they leave. And then the court also looked at the results of the system. So I think I said at the very beginning, when we were fighting over what the education clause requires, respondents, the General Assembly argued, you should only look at the input. Like, you should only look at what we're putting into this. You really shouldn't be looking at what's coming out, because what's coming out is affected by so many things, right? And we push back on that just as a first principle, that yes, of course, people come into schools with their whole lives and all their issues and all their problems, but we argued it's the school system's obligation to teach those children. And so what does that look like? And what does that look like in low-wealth school districts? And what does that look like? What's possible in a higher-wealth school district? And so part of what we went through with the court was all the outcomes that these low-wealth school districts are facing. About 500,000 students in Pennsylvania do not score proficient in math year over year over year. And I think they're about what, 1.7 million students. So that's a very large amount of Pennsylvania students who are not scoring proficient in math. And we went through, language, we went through science, we went through all these other measures, APs, SATs, graduation, post-graduation rates of like getting into college, actually finishing college. And we went through all of these, not just like as a whole number, like 500,000, which is quite high, but looking at it when you break it down by the wealth school district. So if it really is that students are having a hard time because things are hard at home, or because they have other challenges, or because they're also learning English, then those, you would expect to see those hardships happen in low-wealth school districts and in high-wealth school districts at about the same level. And what you saw was really that the achievement gaps were really, really, really big. So sorry, this is just another data point of just overall 300,000 of the approximate 870,000 students taking the PSSA and Keystones did not reach proficiency, which is like what is considered passing. Okay, so achievement gaps are what we spoke about, what I just spoke about. Looking at, when you look at subgroup data, which the Pennsylvania Department of Education tracks, so by demographic, by race, by wealth, you see very starkly that there are these huge achievement gaps between subgroups. So when you compare, for example, Black and Hispanic students scored advanced or proficient at lower rates than their white peers. 71% of white students scored advanced or proficient. And by comparison, Black students scored 34% lower, about 30% lower in each of these categories: English language arts, math, and science. And there was also a lot of fight about what these achievement gaps are from. So we had the former Deputy Secretary of Education, so the Pennsylvania Department of Education official that was in charge of the school system, Matt Stem, and he testified for about 2 days. And he talked about his experience as an official overseeing the system and his knowledge as an educator. And he really, really clearly said, well, it's the lack of resources in the local districts. These achievement gaps, they can be closed, they can be shrunk. The achievement gaps that we see, we can trace them back to educational opportunity gaps. And so to that end, these gaps cannot be mitigated without. Another really good way to explain why money is the thing that matters is to look at, if you look by subgroups, so you're looking at students who are living in poverty, and you're looking at some of the ones that are being educated in low-wealth school districts compared to students living in poverty, but they're being educated in a high-wealth school district. You're going to see really big differences based on what the schools can spend in how they're doing. And we're not, to avoid the argument that we're comparing apples to oranges, we did this by subgroup. So we didn't say a kid in a low-wealth versus a kid in a low spending versus high spending. We said a student living in poverty living in a low spending school district compared to a student living in poverty being educated in a high spending school district. And these are the differences. So the court in the end found money matters. And that was actually 90% of what we had to prove, is that money matters. That students, even if they're coming in the door with challenges, even if they're coming in the door with additional needs, that those needs can be met with the right resources, and those resources cost. And those resources are resources not like theoretical resources, but resources that wealthier districts do financially. So this was sort of the best encapsulation I could find in the 700 and some pages of how the court put this all together. And her words are better than mine, so I'll just read it. Based upon the evidence presented, it is evident to the court that the current system of funding public education has disproportionately negatively impacted students who attend schools in low-level school districts. This disparity is the result of a funding system that is heavily dependent on local tax revenue, which benefits students in high-wealth districts. It is also impacted by a funding formula that does not adequately take into account student needs, which are generally higher in low-wealth districts. As a result, students in low-wealth districts do not have access to the educational resources needed to prepare them to succeed academically, socially, and forcefully. So at the end of all this, she issued an order. It's 2 pages. And this is what it is. And for someone who's been working on this for so long, seeing this is really exciting. These are things that a court has never had a chance to decide before, and they're really momentous. I know that there's a lot of work ahead, and we'll be talking about that, but at least for a lawyer who's convinced herself she's adding value, having the court say this, having the court declare this, is really, 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 really fundamental. So the court declared that the education clause requires every student to receive a meaningful opportunity to succeed academically, socially, and civically, which requires that all students have access to a comprehensive, effective, and contemporary system, and that respondents have not fulfilled their obligations to all children under the education clause in violation of the rights of petitioners. And then you may remember a long, long time ago, at the beginning of this presentation, I said that we also had an equal protection claim, arguing that the way the system disproportionately affects students in low-wealth districts violates their rights to equal protection. And so the court also held that students who reside in school districts with low property values and incomes are deprived of the same opportunities and resources as students who reside in school districts with high property values and incomes. And the disparity can't be justified by anything that the government said was their justification for making this system work the way it did. And so as a result of these disparities, petitioners and students attending low-wealth districts are also being violated and deprived of their equal rights. So the remedy, what do we do with this? The court acknowledged that she's in uncharted territory. This is as far as anyone's ever gotten in Pennsylvania. Other states before it have come up with ways to implement an order like this. And her decision was to allow respondents, so the General Assembly, the governor, Pennsylvania Department of Education, along with us, the petitioners, the school districts, ours, and the LACP, to be given the first opportunity to address the constitutional deficiencies. So what she said was, I'm giving you first crack at making a plan for how to actually fix this. And now we're on to the plan part. So we're really at the very beginning stage of this. Governor Shapiro had his budget address a couple weeks ago, maybe 2 months ago now, I lost track of time, and is now working on the budget for this next year. And we have really advocated for, and the larger advocacy committee has really advocated for what we are calling a meaningful down payment. Okay, so 4.5 billion is a very big number, and it's not going to get fixed in 1 year. And so what we've asked the state to do is to put in a very meaningful down payment to start the process of fixing this gap. And the other thing that we've asked, and we're continuing to ask of the government, is that they make a plan to figure out how much it's going to cost, how that money is going to be allocated, so that this can really start, the wheels can start moving. If you think about 2014 and how old a kindergartner was then compared to now, we can't have it take another 9 years before something is fixed. Kids grow up. So we are working with all of you, hopefully, to push the governor, to push the General Assembly on this. His initial budget address was a start, but not enough. And so there are specific talking points, which I'm sure Susan will talk about, in terms of pushing our leaders to do more and to do more sooner in order to get the system into constitutional compliance. The court said first opportunity, and so this is our opportunity to try and get it right. The road ahead includes me going back to my hotel room today and writing another brief because litigation always has another round. And so right now, the legislative respondents are not, so then Speaker Cutler, who was the respondent during the trial and is no longer the speaker, he has returned to the case as the leader of the caucus, and he has filed along with now Senator Ward a request to the court, to Judge Code-Dubilier, to review her decision because they think she made errors. This is something that most respondents do when they lose. The party that loses goes back to the court and says, can you look at this again? And it's typically just something that you have to check as a box in order to then appeal to the next court, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. So right now we're involved in what's called post-trial motions before President Code-Dubilier. However, there has been a lot of press about the fact that respondents have said to Governor Shapiro and to others that they aren't actually planning to, so that it may be that this is the end of the road, this last sort of exchange of briefs that we're doing right now. There's an oral argument before President Judge Code-Dubilier in May 22nd here in Harrisburg to just sort of, again, review what she found, why she found it, why she's right. And then after that, we shall see. So that's on the litigation front. And then on the remedy front, on what's happening going forward, Speaker McClinton has recently come out and acknowledged that she thinks this is a problem, that she's not going to be challenging the court's decision, that she's going to be working with the leadership to try and put together some sort of vehicle for figuring out how much the system needs, how to get the system. So that's me. And now I will give it to Susan to tell everyone what to do.
So, thank you. Every time I hear somebody talk about the lawsuit, I feel like I learn like more of the nuance and more of like how thorough this decision was and how important that decision was. And just, we were getting ready to have a press conference right after the decision came out, and we had to pick quotes to put on posters to take with us. And I have to say, one of the attorneys said, we want all of that last page of the document that you showed, we want that on a poster. And so we put it on a poster, and as you can imagine, it was not like the most attractive or visually appealing poster, but we have it. So when we're all done with our advocacy, we're going to send it down to your law centers and you can post it someplace. But, you know, just when you look at her decision, read that, it makes it so clear that what Harrisburg has been doing and what lawmakers have been getting away with for decades, for generations, is wrong. And so this is not a new issue in Pennsylvania. Literally for decades, families and advocates and children have been going to Harrisburg and have been saying to state lawmakers, we need your help. This isn't right. Our kids don't have what they need. And state lawmakers have said, this is the money that we have, and this is what we are going to spend. And that is the way that it is. And so, you know, having this court decision is something that gives all of us like another tool in our toolkit when we go to Harrisburg. When lawmakers get sworn into office, they swear that they are going to uphold the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And right now, they are not doing that. They are not doing their jobs. This has been a clear decision. If it is appealed, there's like 0% chance that it will be overturned. The Supreme Court will look at this very thorough decision, nearly 800 pages, and say, that sounds right. I would assume, correct? Like it seems inconceivable that it would get overturned. So we have that. That said, in other states where these lawsuits have been gone through the system and where they've won these cases, legislatures, if they are able to, in many cases, don't do anything. So we have allies that we work with in North Carolina, and they got a decision that was very similar to this 25 years ago. They still have not gotten the money in their school system because their state legislature has just said, what are you gonna do to us, right? And so our job as advocates is to build the public and the political will on the outside of that building, so that lawmakers on the inside of the building understand that it is in their own interest and in the interest of the communities that they represent to not delay any longer, but instead to come to the table and to find a solution that is going to fix this system, which is really truly one of the most unjust, amoral, inequitable systems in the entire nation. So there were a whole bunch of organizations that have worked together. So I'm the executive director of Education Voters of Pennsylvania. We are the only statewide organization that works on education policy and advocacy. And so like our sole focus is adequate, equitable funding for students and making sure that we are not sending precious public dollars out into private pockets where they will get wasted. So we are opposed privatization and we want funding for schools. We have worked with organizations that are focused on education, organizations that have really nothing to do with education, but that care about kids. So like the Unitarian Universalist Church is a really strong partner. The Budget Policy Center, you are all a strong partner. Organizations that work with immigrant communities and impacted communities. We have all come together, and prior to the lawsuit starting, we formed a group called Thorough and Efficient. And good as the result that it gets in the community. So everybody in Pennsylvania needs to understand that we have a school funding lawsuit happening. So on the first day of the trial, we got 150 people, maybe even more than that. And we went to the outside steps of the Capitol and we held a rally and we celebrated the first day of the trial. Everybody then walked over and went in front of the courthouse and started chanting, which was not actually what we were supposed to do. And so I was sent over to retrieve everyone because we did not want to start the first day of the school funding lawsuit by having disruption. So we all came back and then we've been really good. And so the actual trial was live streamed because it was happening during COVID. And I just want to say, when you think about being an attorney in the middle of COVID, who has to go into a courtroom, who has to live in Harrisburg 6 days a week, probably sometimes more. Were you in this hotel or the Hilton? We were in the Hilton. So you're in the Hilton for all of those months, not seeing your family, not only being in the courtroom, but preparing witnesses and getting your testimony and all of the data. I mean, the sacrifice that attorneys made for our children, I think we should all recognize this. But we were able to, it was all live streamed because it was COVID. So anybody who wanted to could just flip on a computer in the morning and watch. And so we watched. And some of the things that were said during that trial were astonishing. Astonishing. Do you want to talk about them? I would love to have you talk.
Sure. So the way we've all watched trials on TV, and some of it, gets very boring. But for the most part, most of the trial was us putting on witnesses, sometimes experts like the expert that crunched the numbers, but a lot of them were our superintendents from the school district. People who had, come to Harrisburg and sat nervously in a waiting room, waiting to be called, and sometimes weren't called on the day they were supposed to, and sometimes ran out of clothes and had to come back. And anyway, so I mean, they were really working double to try to be witnesses for us. And so they get to put on their testimony. Many of my many trial counsel partners would put on this witness and ask them questions and have them sort of talk about their experience. And then respondents, the attorneys for the legislative respondents, so Speaker Cutler and then Senator Corman, were allowed to cross-examine. And so a lot of the cross-examination is intended to make the person seem less credible, to maybe get information that makes their claim look less dire. But they really they really did not shy away from arguing with our superintendents about the conditions of their schools, about the needs of their students, about the things that they have said in public to their taxpayers, to their constituents, to try and buck them up and say, you know what, we're gonna keep fighting. We have a lot of good here. They would say, oh, I heard you said you had a lot of good here in this district. So why in this courtroom are you saying there's a lot of things missing? And often they would quibble over, for example, some of those photos that I showed. They would say, well, can you zoom in over in this corner? I see a computer. I thought you said that you lacked technology, or you know, and I mean, I'm biased, obviously, but here we are saying, oh, well, thank you for showing our really intense picture again and blowing it up. And then there were some real moments of, you know, and I think a lot of the undertone of a lot of it was that poverty is destiny, and that some students just don't care about school, and some students are never going to succeed, and you really can't lay it at the school system. And often that was a dog whistle. Often that was not explicit, but there were some moments that I do think also ended up on signs where the quiet part was said out loud. And so one of our superintendents was being questioned about the merit of academic standards. So there is a set of standards in Pennsylvania that every student has to meet a certain amount of math, science, English language arts, etc. And the attorney for Senator Palma was saying to the superintendent, but not everyone really needs algebra, right? The Constitution says that an education system just has to meet the needs of the Commonwealth. We have a lot of needs. We need, I think he said pizza flippers, which I would not recommend you for the pizza. But what he was getting at, of course, was that, you know, we need people in starvation wage jobs. We need people to do the work that the rest of us don't want to be doing. And so maybe a system that serves the needs of the Commonwealth doesn't actually have to provide algebra 2 to every single student. You know, he continued on and said, well, does a person who works at McDonald's need to understand biology? Does a stonemason need to understand biology? And so there were many moments like that, unfortunately, or fortunately in some ways, because, you know, I don't think that they shied away from really expressing the belief of their leaders and their clients. And it allowed us to at least just sort of confront that head on. And so in that case, we brought the superintendent back in and asked him a few more questions, such as, would it help someone who's working at McDonald's to understand biology, such that maybe they can understand how to keep people safe in a pandemic? Is it possible that you shouldn't decide which students aren't going to have algebra and which students are going to be pizza flipping based on the wealth of communities in which they live? And so it just allowed us, I think, in some ways, as a gift, as my colleague said, to be able to just really confront that head on and not just have it that was whispered in the corners.
And the moment when that attorney started going off on his like little riff, you could tell, like, we watched you, everybody had your papers, you had your notes, everybody had, it was methodical, it was everything. And then this guy like kind of set things down and he just started talking, you know, and he just kept going. And he said, I think it was like, what use does a student on the McDonald's track have for biology? And you could tell he was speaking from his heart. It was what he believed. It was why he did the work he does every single day. And you thought about the attorneys who were coming in, and every superintendent I saw broke down at some point, like in tears. These are people who are, I mean, they're on the front lines every day. They have say tip lines. So anytime there's a problem in their school with mental health issues, they have a phone and it goes to them. They're responsible for the safety of children. They're responsible. They're the CEOs of the districts that are responsible for the opportunities. These are people who are, it's the hardest job. They handle everything. And in this trial, it was hard to watch, right? And that the lawyers, the attorneys for the other side, they were like evangelical about this belief that really, truly, we have kids who we need in some places to be able to do the jobs, as you said, to work for the starvation wages. And that is what we're fighting in that building. That is what many, many, many people in positions of very, very serious power believe about our children. And so that's why we are here. So in terms of mobilizing and making people understand that the lawsuit was happening, we had the opening rally, and then we said we should do something in the middle, and we should really highlight like some of what's happening and try to bring it to life for people. So there was the Panther Valley superintendent had testified that there were 75 kindergartners who shared a single toilet. And so I think I am very far away from having had like a little child, like my kids are grown up. But then when you really think about little kids, their hands don't really work. They have to go potty a lot. There are 75 students with one toilet. How much learning can you do in a day? And how many of these little children have accidents every day? And think about what that does to a little kid. And so, but that was all they could do. So we were like, all right, we got it. I had just pulled the toilet out of my house. We had an old dirty toilet, and we built a little stand for it. We dragged it up the Capitol steps, and we branded toilet paper rolls. We had like these pyramids of toilet paper, and we brought people together again, and we put together 75 quotes of things that people had said during that trial. And we had 75 people come up to read their quote. Each was about a minute. Say, like, this is what it's like. If you're waiting in line, and 75 people to go to the bathroom, this is how long it takes. And so we used that to get people engaged. And then after the lawsuit was over, you know, we have email lists, we were doing webinars, we were really talking to organizations, bringing more people in. We said, you know, we can't expect people to be able to come to Harrisburg. It's hard. So let's hold vigils to mark the solemn over. Families have been fighting for this for so long. And so we had people to hold vigils in their own communities, wherever they were, to take a moment and to read a proclamation about the lawsuit and to reflect on our thoughts, actions, and what we were going to do next. And so we had, well, I think in 30 different communities, over 650 people participated in these vigils, and we mailed them signs, and we have all these beautiful photos of people who were engaged. So we did all that, and then it went quiet, right? Because then the judge had the materials, and she had to wait, and then she had to issue a decision. And so we are just doing our regular work that we do, talking to people about the budget. And then she makes her decision. And then we had multiple people in multiple cities having these great celebration events. And then yesterday we had an advocacy day. Now, I've been doing this since 2011. So we heard about a $1.2 billion cut in education funding in my town in Shippensburg. We went to our school board and we said, we're hearing that we're going to lose $1 million in funding. And our school board looked at us and said, yes, in fact, that is how it works. If the state cuts $1 million in funding from our local school district, we don't have any way to make that up on the local level. We're just going to have to cut. We're going to have to do $1 million in cuts to your kid's school. So, you know, I was a stay-at-home mom. Most of my friends were stay-at-home. We went back to my living room and we're like, what the heck are we going to do about this? Nobody is talking about this. And so we said, let's have a mock bake sale. So we went to Harrisburg. We held a mock bake sale. We said we're going to have to sell 2.4 billion cookies to make up for the $1.2 billion in cuts. Like, this is ridiculous. What are we supposed to do? And so, you know, that was our first foray into this. And during that time period, there were people who got involved in the education funding issue because we lost 20,000 educational professionals from our schools in 2011. The kids who are in schools today have never been in a fully funded classroom. And so what that means as they graduate high school and they go into college is that we have like a whole generation of kids who've never had this. So, you know, there have been people working on this for a very, very long time. What happened in Harrisburg yesterday was something I have never seen before. We put out a call and we just said, we're having a Pennsylvania Schools Work Advocacy Day. We are the School Funding Coalition. We sent out a couple emails and said, we're going to be in Harrisburg. We would love to have you join us. And I expected like the typical, you know, 40 or 50 people would come, set up some legislative visits. That was not what would happen. We had people calling us and saying, I'm from Chester Upland. We want to send a bus full of students. We are with Black Voters Matter in Philadelphia. We want to send a bus. We are in Pittsburgh. We want to send a bus. We are in the Lehigh Valley. We need help to get transportation. We want to send 40 people. We had over 160 people in Harrisburg yesterday, standing on the Capitol steps from urban districts, rural districts, Western South, the entire state, who were there to speak together with one single voice for our children. And as this has never happened before, these were all 100% parents There were no organized groups, you know what I mean? It wasn't like we had unions, it wasn't like we had professional associations. It was people who care about their kids, and it was sending out like 2 or 3 emails that had that happen. And so we are right now at a moment in Pennsylvania where we just need to continue building this movement. And if I'm being completely honest, I think we are gonna win this. And I think that we are going to put enough pressure on Harrisburg. There are enough eyes on that building for the first time in decades. People understand what's happening and they know why it's happening. And they have made the connection between what's happening in their local school district and the decisions their lawmakers make in Harrisburg. Now, that said, we have budgetary issues, and that's, you know, the Budget and Policy Center, Diana's excellent analysis. We know that there is not surplus funding that is long-term in Harrisburg to meet the $4.6 billion gap. That is recurring funding every year. We also know that Governor Wolf, on his way out of office, he was an excellent governor. He was excellent for education. But one of the last things he did was enact a cut in the corporate net income tax. And so every year, our corporate net income tax right now is 9.99%. Every year, it's going to go down 1% until it gets to 4.99%. That is going to blow a massive hole open in our budget because the taxes that we are collecting from businesses and corporations are going to start to decrease. And so the costs that we have for everything are going to stay the same. In fact, with inflation, everything is going up. And not only do we need to keep up with inflation, but we need new recurring revenue so that we can finally fix the school funding system. So we have, as we fight for the school funding system, we also are going to have to fight for new revenues that are going to be raised in a way that is going to have the least impact on the people who are least able to pay more in new funding. It's going to take all of us, and we're going to have to come together. But you know what I mean? Like, look at the Twitter feed for Ed voters to look at some of these photos from people who came out yesterday. Like, we are in a special moment, and we are going to win this. But we need everybody together. And the one other thing I will say, Harrisburg has been incredibly skilled, incredibly expert. Those lawmakers up there in pitting rural communities against urban communities, and they would say, all the money goes to the cities, and if we increase funding, the cities are just going to get all of it. And then other lawmakers would say, those urban districts, they're getting more than their fair share of funding, and we need to take the funding away from them. They've had declining populations, so they got too much. And I will say, what we have done with the school funding lawsuit is we have said, we are all in this together, and all of us are speaking with one voice. It is Harrisburg that has the problem. So we have finally also cracked that nut, and we are not allowing them to like divide us and pit us against each other. And that is the other thing that we have to be able to continue doing forward, because moving forward, like the little kid in a 450 person school district who has a teacher who's teaching 2 classes in the same room at the same time. And the little kid who's sitting in an urban district can't even be in his building because it's been closed because there's asbestos. Each of them have problems that need to be fixed by those people. And neither of those kids is at fault, and neither of those kids should be demonized. The people who need to be demonized are the people in the building who are standing in the way of other kids getting what they need. So, question? We'll let Katya moderate here.
Yeah, thank you both so much. I always learn something new every time. Does anyone have any questions or comments?
Yeah. Okay. So I went to a low funded school, and in our history class, we could never take home the books because there was only enough supplies while we were in class. So I understand exactly where you guys are coming from, and I didn't even know there was a lawsuit before today. And I think this is great what you guys have done.
Thank you. What was your school district?
Just Mercer County, but it was like Greenville.
Yep.
Yep.
I remember I was on the school board, and my daughter came home from school with her French textbook, and it had the USSR in it. And the French teacher had, like videotapes, like the VHS videotapes that she was using to like do the pronunciation. And and then she also had cassette tapes. And she treated those things like they were made of pure gold. Because if anything happened to them, she had nothing left. And so I just remember, we were like, okay, how much does it actually cost to update the French textbooks? And I remember when we got the new French textbooks, I remember this party. Not having, like, the USSR, you know what I mean? And they were dog-eared and really truly the teacher was like, I gotta get the cassette player today. You know what I mean? And this was like 5 years ago. So and kids know what it feels like when that is what they get. And again, we also had a problem with math textbooks. Students could not take math textbooks home. So tell me how you're supposed to do your math homework when you can't take your math textbook home. So I hear you. So yep.
Yeah, in 2021 and 2, when we had witnesses on the stand, a lot of them brought up textbooks. A lot of them brought
That
up.
was a big issue in my school.
Yeah, the superintendent of Ottawa Alfred School District said that, he found a book that had his name in it, like from the news.
Wow.
Any other questions or comments?
So I'm from rural Ohio, like you said earlier, we go to school in rural Pennsylvania. And I know this, I have the resources in Harrisburg, help, or stuff like that, and there's the financial resources, and just the time commitment, available. So I guess people like me that wanna help, but aren't necessarily always able to. What would you recommend that people like me do, just to do something?
Yep, so I would say you should sign up for the education voters panel list, and then we'll tell you what is happening. I don't know if you're registered to vote in Pennsylvania or Ohio. Ohio, yeah, so, you have many, I used to teach in Ohio. You have many problems too. So whatever we're doing here, you probably just send a letter to your own lawmaker. But, if you are registered, first of all, you know, if you're in Pennsylvania, if you're registered to vote, that's really important. And then we make it really easy for you to send letters to your lawmakers, to contact them. And sometimes there is an incredible impact just taking 10 minutes and writing up an email to your lawmaker and say, I'm a constituent, I grew up in this district, this is the experience I had. I just learned about the school funding lawsuit, and I really hope you're gonna go to Harrisburg to fight for these kids, because they often don't hear from people. And when they do hear from people and it's like a personal letter, it has an impact and it makes them think about it. And if you have family members, having your family members, you know, kind of talk about it. You know, we're always happy. I'm always happy to hop on the road to go talk to people. So like if you had a class and you wanted, you know, we could do it by Zoom, or if you had like an evening meeting to come to talk to people. I was just in Indiana County. I have driven all over the state pre-COVID to talk to people. The best event I've been at ever over all those years with Indiana County. We had like 50 people came out. We were with Matt Splain. We were talking about the school funding lawsuit. And people got really agitated, and they were ready to go and talk to their lawmakers. And so I think that getting people talking to lawmakers is like the most important thing that you can do. And it doesn't have to take a lot of time. It's pretty easy, and it makes a huge difference. So, I have a question.
Yeah, I was just curious, like, if the state doesn't move to address this issue, or if they're moving too slowly, like, what happens?
Great question. I think we have two different answers, that will work together. So, on the litigation front, we can go back into court and lay out for the court what we see as their inaction. And we are prepared to go back into court at some point, and make our case to the judge that that first opportunity language you saw, it's happened. We certainly hope that we won't be standing in front of her saying it's been squandered, but that is a tool in our toolbox, on the litigation side.
Yeah, and I think we just, you know, I think we're working to get the best budget that we can get right now, trying to get the House to increase over what Governor Shapiro has proposed and to include a level of supplements, really continue accelerating funding for the lowest, the districts with the least funding available. Once the budget is over, there is gonna need to be a campaign, a statewide hardcore campaign to say it is time for Governor Shapiro and legislative leaders to get to the table and to find a solution. So Governor Shapiro will introduce his budget in February of next year. He has made a commitment. He has said he is supportive of this and that he wants to make it good and to not have this be a constitutional problem. But I think we've seen in Harrisburg, they will go the path of least resistance. So we're gonna have to be on them, telling them, all right, have you met yet? Are you getting to the table? What's the solution? And it's gonna have to come from constituents to their lawmakers.
And then like legally, if the state doesn't challenge the ruling, can anyone else challenge it or it has to be the defendant?
Has to be the defendants, yeah.
Any other questions?
I guess this is more of just a thank you, honestly. My mom has been teaching for 30 years now, and she has truly seen the impact of funding and how hard it is to just get a pack of pencils for her students in her classroom. So I just wanted to thank you for doing this.
Thanks to your mom.
Yeah.
Thank you. Are any more questions? Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.